nice to be here. My name is Mo. I'm a senior security engineer at Roblox. Right now I'm on the governance, risk, and compliance team, focused on supply chain and AI risk management. Before this, I was in AppSec for almost 10 years. I recently made the switch because I thought that there was a lot of interesting problems to solve in the AI space, and what better place to do it than where I'm at now. But just by a show of hands, because I get confused for a construction company all the time, does anybody know what Roblox is? Okay, cool. Does anyone still think I work at a construction company? Awesome. Cool. So a couple things to start, obvious disclaimers, but this presentation is purely educational and informational, and is not, these views are basically my own, not in my employers, so to speak. So I do have a pretty short agenda here. Doesn't mean that the content is just short. However, this field is changing very quickly. It's not a time frame of like weeks or months. Things are typically changing, sometimes in days, sometimes in hours. Sometimes we find out over a tweet. So again, I wanted to make sure that by the end of this session, we have a couple of things that you're able to take away back to your organization and implement in one way or another. And just some things to think about. But before we actually talk about what's AI risk management or what are we doing, we kind of have to cover how did we actually get here. So for me, I started in AI a couple of years ago before Roblox, and I was in this organization that everyone on the AI team in particular had a PhD, which is kind of awesome. There were a couple of folks that didn't, but for the most part, they all had PhDs. And I'm the type of person that's like, well, I need to understand how something works and how to build something before I can actually go and use it and feel like I can properly provide security advice. So I went and I tried to learn machine learning at the time. And it was very difficult because I'm not a computer and I am very bad at learning. So when I was doing this, it was just a bunch of downloading open source packages and trying to find really high quality data sets, trying to configure the right machine, figuring out that my old 2016 laptop was no good, having to buy a 1080 in the middle of a GPU crisis again. And it was just months before I could actually start getting going or anything. And this is kind of how the whole thing worked. It was figuring out how to get GPU workloads to work properly, how to make sure we had really good data, making sure we were training properly. And it took a team of PhDs to do that. And a couple of years, about 3 years ago maybe, 2022, I was able to start doing things like this. And if you can't see it in the back, I'm interacting here with a chat bot asking what Lovecraftian monster would be best at doing code review. And I did this for fun because why not? I love Call of Cthulhu, and I thought this would be a funny thing to ask, AI with all of its intelligence. So we're just able to interact with all of this data, all at our fingertips essentially. And I could again ask it about, get context on Lovecraft, get context on code review, understand which ancient being was going to be best at performing this task. And most recently, I can now generate a pretty good picture of what it would look like. And even more recently, we've got a PR that actually has really good text. So I don't think I'll actually ever leave that anywhere, but it still shows how things have kind of changed and really rapidly, where anyone can go interact with the chatbot and generate almost anything, create a silly idea, get information, and access a world's worth of knowledge. I mean, yeah. So in 2023, Gartner actually made this really great chart, and there's a lot of things happening here. I used some emojis to kind of help describe it, and there's even a little term called the slope, or not the plateau, there it is, the trough of disillusionment, which I thought was kind of hilarious for Gartner. But if you look at the right of that, you see all of these different just names and things and different icons, different colors. What those represent are the kind of potential of each of these technologies and where they would eventually plateau. For the most part, we see a couple of 2 to 5 years around like open source LLMs. We see something around AGI, and we see AI simulation. All of these have varying different lengths. And we look, and they're all at the innovation trigger piece, which shows that things at that place have the most potential to grow, right? And how long will it take, all the colors represent how long it will take to actually get to its full potential. And AGI over there is kind of interesting because it's the only one in the yellow triangle. And that represents over 10 years before we actually hit a plateau there. So if you think about that, we've got a long way to go with AI, and we are just getting started. And we're already seeing a lot of these like use cases pick up in what they can do and how businesses are implementing AI. So the most common place we've started seeing it is how customers interact with the business. So this may be a customer service chatbot, right? It could be a business internally working with an HR function to work on onboarding. We're finding different ways for people to interact with AI first versus let's figure out how to get really deep system level integrations. We're trying to find all of these, how can we get it in the hands of people as fast as possible to solve some of the most basic things first. So we see a lot of customer contact services here. There's a lot of customer acquisition, so if you ever get like an email that's automated, there you go. And all of these other sorts of in-your-face kind of ways. And by 2026, we're looking at 80% of enterprises using AI in some way, shape, or form in production environments. So what does that mean? If you haven't already started seeing AI in the workplace, well, one, I don't know how, but two, it's going to be there eventually in one way or another. As security people, I think that kind of brings us to the question, well, we're going to have to start getting ready to, adopt and really work with the business to get this technology in their hands. And a lot of it can feel like we are building the plane while flying. I know, great segues. So AI risk is kind of interesting. I have a pretty unpopular opinion on it, but I've talked to a couple of colleagues, and I think we're a little bit in agreement. AI risks have really, or AI in general, has opened up the threat surface that is just available for attackers. And there's a lot more ways that attackers can have access to different types of information. However, impacts typically tend to be things that we already understand, right? So if there is an exploit of a customer service chatbot that is now giving refunds out of nowhere, we understand that impact as a financial impact. This is something that I think we already have frameworks for. However, when we talk about AI, there are other things that we need to keep in mind. We do have a few novel and emerging risks that we're starting to see a lot more of, especially when we have this technology that is in the hands of people. People are typically talking to chatbots that are in either a customer service function or are just made available to them. Folks are going to see ethics and bias-driven decisions that a chatbot may make that might not align with where you want to see a product go. There's synthetic identity, or the potential for a false identity to be created that doesn't necessarily mean it's a real person, but it looks close enough. So we have all these different things that really did not exist in the same way that we interpret other threats. And it's not always clear to understand how we manage these things as well. Over the last couple of years, as AI has been evolving, we've seen a lot of different types of frameworks come out to say, hey, this is how you should manage this is how you should manage that. We've seen in the world of compliance a ton of different legislation, regulation, everyone is trying to get their heads around what's going on. And as someone who is working as part of a security program, it's kind of tough to define exactly what we need to be doing all the time. Everything is just changing so fast. Additionally, there are a lot of lawsuits that take place where companies are getting sued, and there's intellectual property, and there's copyright, and this changes how you want to interact with data. So, and the name of the game for AI is data. So we want to be really cognizant of stuff in that area as well. And on the supply chain, we can get really deep into third and fourth party risk, but I do cover that a little bit later too. So one of the things that we can think about as we start seeing all of these different emerging risks, all of these different activities that we'll need to start seeing, doing, and all of the incoming information that we're getting about AI, is how do we think about our risk management program in terms of like the goals? And I think everybody in security wants to be an enabler. We don't want to be a blocker. So how can we think about our risk management program here as an enabler for safe innovation? If a company is going to take AI and they want to use it, how can we make sure that they're doing it in a way that's really safe? And how do we also show that the things that we're doing and the activities we're doing are moving us in the right direction, and we're not just doing things to do things? So, how do we set our program up for success? I think there are a couple of things that I like to think about, at least in terms of program management and just product security, that when looking at AI, a lot of them just made sense for translating, or translated really well. So what's launching soon, right? Working closely with product teams to understand exactly what's coming out and what are the things that we actually need to focus on. What types of products are your teams building, and where exactly do we need to be concerned about? Are we building something that is going to be customer facing? Are we building something that is just going to be for a couple of people in a team? Are we building something that is foundationally changing the way people are going to look at an industry or a couple of different types of information? How foundational is the thing that we are building? So these are really interesting. This is a really good question that I like to ask or think about and keep in my head when I look at an AI risk management program. The next part is how do we think how AI is actually going to be used here, right? Is it going to be something that is being internally built? Again, I mentioned foundational because foundation typically means you are building, not just building something from scratch, but you are doing something that will be changing an industry in some cases. This will require you to be a lot more scrutinous because now you have weights to consider. Now you do have to consider the data set and everything about that. Additionally, are you just choosing to integrate AI into your product through a vendor or a third party, right? And then how do we do that? This changes how we look at that security review initially and that intake. And the third part is how do you establish quick wins? In application security, I never got anything done without having a partner somewhere or without having help from other people. But in order to do that, you need to establish trust. You also need to show that your program is effectively managing a risk and you're able to enable the business in some way. So how do you find those quick wins in an organization, and how do you find it at the beginning of your program? So I know I talked about frameworks earlier, and that we shouldn't just be using any framework that, just to use a framework. But we should actually be thinking about frameworks in terms of, okay, this gives us a really good start. It gives us a couple of things to think about, and especially in AI, it will give us at least the thoughts of like where regulation's going, where are different governing bodies thinking about the implementation overall. So most of these frameworks that have come out in the last couple of years have all been really good at giving a really high-level view. It doesn't give you exactly what you need to go and create the best program ever, but it will give you a really good starting point. This also lets you, again, these frameworks are not one-size-fits-all approaches. However, depending on the type of organization you are, depending on where you are in your maturity journey, they do give you different indicators of maturity overall, and they let you kind of pick what you can use here, what you can use there, and what will move you forward. One of the frameworks I like to think about when looking at this is actually the MITRE framework. MITRE released this really good document that's about 35 pages. It's a good weekend read if you're a slow reader like me. But it's really good at telling you where your organization is in terms of maturity levels. And they define it really well, too. The one thing that I will say about the MITRE AI toolkit is that it is very detailed. There's about 6 pillars for each one for the MITRE playbook. And in each one of those, there's another, I think, 4 to 6 different properties of each. So it can be a lot of work to implement at the beginning. I mean, it will take a lot of time, effort, a lot of cross-functional. I wouldn't recommend going straight forward and trying to boil the ocean here. So I kind of highlighted 2 that I found are really interesting to look at and take apart. In the data pillar, we have security and privacy. This one mainly focuses on different pieces of data. It focuses on how we're actually ingesting data, a little bit more about data provenance, understanding data security. I can say data 100 more times, but that's what it's focused on. The other one is AI innovation, and this one is kind of different. Like I said before, I'm thinking of a product security approach to this and thinking that this is actually a really good way to get business sign-on for a lot of these security efforts. So the AI innovation piece helps tie some of the security controls and measures you'd like to implement into a language that the business can use in a way to say, hey, by implementing this security control, we're actually showing that we're innovating here. And everybody likes a win. And it's great if you can give the business a win through a security exercise that gives you a win as well. The other one I'd like to talk about is the NIST AI playbook. So where MITRE gives you a lot of this really high-level language and a lot of good ways to show how you're growing in maturity, the NIST AI playbook is really specific for security. It will give you a little bit more information on how you're actually doing these different pieces, and it will give you a lot more understanding for that functional program management piece. So, for example, one of the things that the NIST framework has is this really, really long piece on mapping. And mapping is one of those early activities that can give you a lot of good information. By mapping, this is identifying where AI exists in your organization. Where are we, how are we implementing AI? How are we documenting it? What's a good way to document it? And so on. So this gives you really good, again, having this information gives you a good understanding of where your program is going, or where your program exists in its current state. Tied with MITRE, sorry, this gives you that way to establish maturity over a long period of time, or as the program grows. So some of the things that we can think about, because we do already have a lot of these processes, you may either have a lot of these processes in place or you're still developing them, is how can you use the current stuff that you have in your organization to get that started already. So the first part is take your security reviews, or the things you're already looking at and how you're looking at it, and think about them in more of an AI-specific context. So if you're building a chatbot and your application security team is looking at it, what are the new things that they need to look at because it's AI? rather than stopping them and say, hey, you need to go and like figure this out today and like build out a proper AI testing harness, figure out what they are able to do today with what they have, with the tooling that they have and the capabilities that the team has, and then say, okay, well, we have this, or we have, this static code analysis, or we have dynamic. How do we want to use this in terms of AI? Again, a little bit tough, but a good example is fuzzing, right? So we could use a fuzzer and give it a bunch of different types of inputs that AI can go through. So for example, if you've got like a chatbot, you decide to fuzz the chatbot in some way, or you hit the API there, then you do get to see some responses. You can start doing a little bit of baselining and quality. It's not going to be as good as if you developed a really robust testing harness for AI red teaming, but you can at least start testing it with some inputs. And again, this isn't to say like, okay, we have everything at the beginning. This is a growing program. The next part is targeting high impact areas for the program so that you can show that, hey, we're able to, again, show success here or in a specific region in your program without having to go and start all over again. The next part is, again, talking about these AI-specific risks. So we had a couple of them at the beginning. This is more like, okay, well, if we have, let's take our third-party management program. We understand these third-party risks that AI poses. How do we now adapt our current program and move it towards this AI piece? This last part is focused on data. And again, if AI is the car, data is the fuel. So ensuring that we have really good data provenance for privacy reasons, and ensuring that we're doing proper record keeping. Ensuring that we already have these controls or documented for doing traceability across AI. It's really important to be able to audit these systems, not just today, but because this is where regulation is moving. So I've taken kind of one of the like easier processes to understand or like see and just broken it up into a couple of different boxes. So if you're already doing security reviews, and these are some areas where you can extend these practices to AIs. So we talked a little bit about automated security gates, using tooling that you already have in your SDLC to kind of help with that. Additionally, you have the security champions, right? So using people throughout an org that can help security move forward is a really good way to identify where AI is, even though it may not be documented. At the beginning of any new program, it's hard to catch everything. You can't just capture everything in a ticket. So it's good to be able to have these people that you can rely on and building that culture of AI security and awareness early on. The self-service security review is probably one of my favorite ones, mainly because this is a way for, if you give people a way to go and ask for something, or you make it easy for them to make a request, then they most likely will. So this is like a really good way to say, hey, we want to start capturing some information on AI and where it is through the org. Again, everybody wants to use AI, so if you give them a way to use it, then they're not going to say no, and they're not going to just implement it without asking or trying to figure out, or they might. And the last part is this ad hoc review piece, and figuring out how to start taking some of these asks that come in an unstructured manner and then converting it back into a manner that can show how the program is moving forward. This next part is a little bit focused on how we can take our supply chain and our third-party pieces and moving that in the same direction. So AI is kind of interesting in the third-party space because there's so many different pieces. So I'm just going to focus on these three because I've found a lot of bang for buck here. For the open source and SSDLC piece, it's finding out like, okay, well, how do we understand open source AI dependencies throughout our product, right? So this could be different open source libraries or dependencies that contribute to the development of AI internally. But it can also be, okay, we're using some open source LLMs. How do we understand of the safety of those? How do we understand which ones we can or can't use? And this does get a little bit into the license piece as well. Licenses are really difficult to understand, and it doesn't get any easier with AI. Some of the licenses may, for instance, after a certain number of users are using a product that has AI enabled, or at least is using a particular open source LLM, may actually not be able to, you won't be as free to use it after a certain amount of people are using that service. So being really careful about like the IP license usage and all that here is very important. So I know that was a lot of like really high level information, which is why we have a bunch of time at the end for some Q&A. But I also want to talk a little bit about looking forward. All of the things that we just talked about before in the last couple of minutes, we're mainly taking your program and figuring out where you can kind of put these pieces that you already have existing into a way that will help you move the program forward. But what does forward look like? How do you move forward? And maybe what are some new activities that you may want to start tacking on once you've started to get a handle of the landscape inside of your organization? So I've talked a couple of times about how regulatory landscape around AI is changing very fast. And there are a couple different approaches to figuring this out and getting ahead of it. And one of them is engaging with your legal partners early on. Working with legal has been, is actually like a really interesting concept for me. Like in security, I think we always think, oh, we need to work with more engineers all the time. But your legal partners here are really, really, really keen to ensure that the organization is in a good place. And they can provide a really agile approach to evaluating new regulation that's coming out. So I'm not a lawyer, and I think I've already told you, but I'm pretty slow at reading. However, none of the lawyers that I've worked with ever in the past are like that. And they can read through a draft of a new bill. They can read through a draft of new regulation and policy that's coming out of the EU or Australia or anywhere else. And I can help them kind of put some of the technical requirements behind that, right? And we can figure it out together. Like, where does this make sense? How does it apply to our organization? And then how can we help with compliance around here? It's a continuous dialogue, a continuous back and forth. You can also do some of your own homework, but I think if you're at RSA, you're already doing this too. But there's always an importance on looking at open source projects, staying up to date with the news, and just understanding how the landscape is changing as well. So to kind of take everything and put a little bow on top of the package, if you had to go back and take everything that we talked about today and move it to next week, I would say you should take a look at that 30-page MITRE document, figure out which pillars most relate with your organization, and then figure where can I go and start looking at these things. So there's a compliance piece. So if you're a compliance-heavy organization, you can actually go through that, work with your compliance team and see, okay, well, we noticed these areas of MITRE are like really good and they align really closely with like how our business operates. Can we maybe start doing something here and start tracking these activities? Can we put these into like a checkbox in our own way and start tracking this? This will help you kind of create those baselines if you don't already have them. It will also help you identify some opportunities in places where you already are doing some of these activities for how you can get better. Again, the last piece of that MITRE document is actually about like 4 to 5 pages on defining how you can move from a level 1 in maturity to a level 5. They're about 1 sentence each for like, okay, well, to move to a level 1 to a level 2, you have to do these things. it's a really good way to just like understand what the big picture is in this sense. Now, there's a lot that happens between month 1 and month 3, but by month 3, you should have already established some quick wins. You should have already found some projects in some ways, and you've gotten into like kind of a groove with assessing AI in your organization. You kind of know where teams are heading. So this might be a really good time to find a few key projects, some long-term initiatives that your organization is working on, and start looking a little bit deeper into those. Figure out where you can partner with the engineering teams and, again, assess their data pipelines. Maybe they are doing something or some activity that is actually really useful to your security team. In the past, I've noticed that a lot of these teams that are working in AI typically know more about AI than we do. And they typically have a better understanding on how to measure certain things. So transparency is one of them. Understanding how to detect bias is another thing that they're typically really good at. And while they're doing fine-tuning, they're actually capturing this already. So this is a really good opportunity to go deep with these teams and figure out, hey, what are you already doing that maybe we're not taking account of? What are the things that you're doing that are security activities that we're not documenting, but do show really good security hygiene in these areas? Then taking any findings that you have and some gaps, and then again going back and saying, okay, well, let's try and solve some of these organizational, these opportunities, these gaps. There's also a piece that I kind of skipped over accidentally that talks about like lower risk reviews and deep dives. And one of the things that you can start thinking about is, again, because security is an enablement function, how do we take some of these lower risk AI use cases and get them into the hands of engineers a little bit faster, right? So I'm sure that there are a ton of folks that want to use AI in code generation, right? That's not a low-risk use case. However, a lot of organizations will want to use this. So how can we enable that if that is where our organization wants to go? We don't want to be the blocker here, and we do want to enable. But this might be a case for a deep dive, whereas maybe we want to take some of the documentation that we have in a portal, and we want to make it really easy to query. This might be a little less risky, especially if we're keeping it internal, right? So how do we enable a team to just go and do that without having to wait maybe weeks or months for a review? And by 6 months, hopefully you've been able to do a couple of these things, and you're able to scale up some of these initiatives in your security program really well. At this point, you can start moving towards a more proactive approach. Figuring out, okay, well, you're doing all of these good things. How do we take these good things and turn them into maybe a portal, or how do we communicate this with stakeholders? How do we start encouraging folks to be more, kind of like start building the culture around AI security? This is actually something that aligns with NIST as well in the govern category. We're building this culture, and then documenting the culture of AI security is a good thing. It's also moving you forward in MITRE maturity, so it's nice to say that we're mature. So that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I think we have some time. So you can just go up to a microphone, or if there are no questions, it's all cool too.
Hey, thanks for that. Could you talk a little bit about maybe how you've seen some of those interactions between maybe GRC folks and engineering go, or maybe some of the things we should kind of be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so you, just so that I understand, you asked how as a GRC professional, how do you interact with engineering?
Yeah, any kind of tips to kind of, you know, push things along, especially as things get a little bit more heavily regulated, or you're trying to implement some of these frameworks or something like that.
Yeah. So one of the most important parts when interacting with any type of business partner is understanding where they're coming from. So I know I talked about it a lot, understanding business priorities and their use cases, but knowing this like the back of your hand is really important. Because as soon as you start to talk to an engineer and you're asking them for something, you need to understand how it's going to affect them, how it's going to affect the product, their timelines, and the things that they care about, right? The other part of that is knowing your controls. So you're about to ask someone to do something. What are you about to ask them to do? What do you have available that they can use to help speed this along? And if you're going to ask them to do something that is foundational from scratch, they do not currently have, then what is this going to look like at the end of the day? Coming to your engineering team, not just as a team that has to fulfill a requirement, is the most important thing here. Rather, I would say treat them as a business partner. Treat them as another person that is a security champion, essentially. And if you want, I have a sticker for you, so you can come up and pick it up. Yeah.
So, when the engineering team or any other team, when they are kind of working on that, most of the team, they will be using the foundational models, and they are just fine-tuning the models, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, what is your recommendation when they are doing some fine-tuning, right? But because it is kind of new, right? AI, if you'll see, right? How do you recommend from the security team perspective, hey, this is the way to do? And what are the any kind of best practices or standards, that can help?
Yeah. So from what I understood, you're asking about how do you properly advise teams that are doing fine-tuning to do this in a safe way. So one, you need to understand their use case, right? What are they actually trying to do? There are certain cases where, and depending on the model that they're using, there are different issues with models, right? So one, you need to have proper model control here. You need to be able to say, okay, well, this is the model we're using. These are the safety understandings of this model. Most of them are published in a model scorecard, right? If not, I would say maybe not use that model, but let's just say they're using a model that's internal, and it's something that they're building themselves. They are going to be responsible for giving you some way of showing that they've done proper transparency testing, right? So in NIST, there are actual guidelines for showing transparency testing. I would say look at those first. A lot of those say, okay, well, these are the types of things you should be testing for. These are the type, right? However, in most of these interactions with the team, they already know who the customer is or where the customer is. And if there's no customers, then what parameters they need to be fine-tuning. So it really just depends on exactly what you're trying to tune for, right?
And those standards, are you referring to the risk management framework, let's say NIST or MITRE?
Yeah, so if you actually, so it's all, if you go to the slide, I have links to everything. So if you go to that NIST slide, it will link you to the NIST AI playbook, which is a PDF. It's 177 pages, and it's got all the different things that you can look into.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I have a sticker for you as well. If you haven't noticed the pattern, I've got stickers, and I'm willing to hand them out. Just stop by. Cool. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much. This is my first time at RSA, so I really appreciate it. And yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Complete the speaker survey. Is that a thing? I heard that that's a thing. Cool. Please complete the speaker survey if you enjoyed the presentation, or if you didn't. I would love the feedback. Yeah, and if you have any questions, please meet me outside. Please don't fight me. I cannot fight.